The crowd watched in horror as Marcus Thorn circled the royal guard, hurling increasingly personal insults. Veterans recognized the brewing storm. Tension locked in the guard's jaw, and the subtle tightening of his grip told a story Thorn couldn't read. That uniform represented years of blood and sacrifice, not a costume for tourists' amusement. Like a compressed spring reaching its limit, the situation escalated when Thorn reached for the ceremonial rifle, mistaking it for a prop. Time slowed as years of disciplined restraint transformed before stunned onlookers. This is the story of what happens when those chosen to guard tradition reveal the deeper purpose behind their unwavering stance at the line of duty. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more thrilling tales. Don't miss out on what happens next. What does it take to stand motionless while the world moves around you? The Royal Guard's stillness isn't just ceremonial, it's the visible edge of something far deeper. Behind those unblinking eyes lies a discipline forged in the crucible of combat, where stillness meant survival and movement could mean death. Staff Sergeant James Kensington stands at his post outside Buckingham Palace, his scarlet tunic and bearskin cap transforming him into a living symbol of British tradition. Beneath the ceremonial exterior beats the heart of a warrior with 8 years of active combat service. His file chronicles a global tour of modern conflict, 3 deployments to Afghanistan's Helmand province, where split-second decisions determined survival. The tourists see a statue. The veterans see something else entirely. James remembers the night outside Kandahar when his patrol was pinned down by insurgent fire. For 6 hours he remained in position, barely breathing, barely blinking, as enemy fighters moved within meters of his location. That night taught him what true stillness means. Not the absence of movement, but the presence of absolute control. Like a leopard poised before the strike, his ceremonial stance appears passive but masks battlefield instincts that remain razor-sharp. Every approach angle, every crowd movement, every potential threat vector, all processed without a visible reaction. The medals adorning his chest tell stories of valor under fire. The military cross awarded after carrying wounded comrades through an active firefight. The Operational Service Medal with its Afghanistan clasp. When tourists photograph these decorations, they capture symbols earned through blood and sacrifice, whose meaning they can barely comprehend. In the same way, his stillness once preserved life in distant war zones. It now upholds centuries of tradition on palace grounds. The Royal Guard's training includes intensive psychological conditioning to maintain composure under extreme provocation. During selection, candidates endure the beasting, hours of verbal abuse, while holding painful positions, their faces inches from drill instructors who scream obscenities and personal insults. Those who flinch are immediately cut. James didn't flinch. The ceremonial rifle weighs 9 pounds, light compared to the fully loaded combat kit he carried through mountain passes and desert heat. His arms show no tremor as he holds it hour after hour. The tourist's camera flashes hold no power to break his concentration. He stared down the flash of muzzle fire. In the crowd gathering around the palace gates, American veterans notice what others miss. They see micro-adjustments in his stance that distribute weight to prevent fatigue. They recognize how his eyes track movement, not following heads but hands, the appendages that carry weapons. One veteran nods respectfully, a silent acknowledgement between warriors who speak the same unspoken language. "Look at his breathing pattern," one veteran whispers. "Controlled, measured. That's not for show." The ceremonial guard's apparent immobility conceals constant assessment. When tension rises, subtle signals reveal his internal state. His grip tightens, jaw muscles set firmly beneath impassive features, and his eyes register peripheral threats with combat-trained awareness. A family approaches too close to the designated boundary. James doesn't move, yet somehow his presence communicates authority so clearly that they step back without being told. This is the language of controlled power, projecting force without deploying it. History provides sobering examples when this disciplined silence was mistaken for weakness. In 1982, a tourist who repeatedly crossed barriers found himself staring down the barrel of a rifle. In 2015, another learned the same lesson when aggressive taunting earned him a thundering "Make way!" that sent onlookers scrambling. The crowd thins around the palace grounds as afternoon progresses. But a different kind of visitor now approaches from the eastern gate, a man whose walk carries the distinctive swagger of someone looking for confrontation. His eyes lock onto James with predatory focus, assessing, calculating. Unlike the veterans who recognize James's hidden strength, this man sees the ceremonial stillness as a challenge rather than worthy of respect. The territorial lines being crossed aren't just the physical barriers marking the guard post. They're the invisible boundaries separating civility from chaos. And Marcus Thorn has spent a lifetime crossing such boundaries. Thorn moves through the crowd with the calculated precision of a predator. Standing 6'2" with broad shoulders and a shaved head, his presence creates an instinctive ripple effect. Tourists shifting away without realizing why. The cobalt blue snake tattoo winding up his neck ends with a forked tongue flicking near his right ear. His knuckles, ridged with scar tissue, telegraph a history of violence, a man who resolves conflicts with fists rather than words. For Thorn, James represents an immovable monument of tradition that he feels compelled to topple. "Look at this circus act," Thorn mutters, loud enough for those nearby to hear. His accent carries the unmistakable cadence of London's East End, hardened by years in confined spaces, consonants sharpened by constant confrontation. This voice has talked its way into and out of trouble across London, leaving institutional respect in tatters wherever he goes. While most visitors approach with innocent curiosity, Thorn's gaze holds something predatory. His eyes methodically scan James from boot to bearskin cap with assessment, looking for weaknesses, pressure points, vulnerabilities. The tourists want photographs. Thorn wants leverage. "Oi, toy soldier," he calls out, deliberately positioning himself in James's sightline. "Does the Queen know you're out here playing dress-up?" The words create an immediate pocket of tension. A mother pulls her children closer. A businessman pretends sudden interest in his phone. Thorn steps forward, crossing the invisible boundary other visitors instinctively respect. His body language broadcasts dominance with every movement. Chest forward, arms slightly away from his sides, chin tilted upward. Unconscious habits of someone who's spent years establishing dominance in environments where physical presence determines survival. "Can you hear me in there, mate?" Thorn's voice carries a precise edge of mockery. Not so aggressive that security would immediately intervene, but sharp enough to cut. "They've got you all wound up like a clock, don't they? Wind you up in the morning, stand you out here for the tourists." This discomfort is Thorn's currency. He feeds on it, growing more animated as the tension rises. Each shift in the crowd's mood registers in his peripheral awareness, a feedback loop that amplifies his performance. "How much they pay you to stand there like a statue?" he continues, voice dropping as he steps closer. "Or do you just do it for the fancy hat?" He mimics the guard's stance with exaggerated stiffness, drawing nervous laughter from onlookers. The kind that comes from discomfort rather than genuine amusement. His prison record reveals what his words imply. 3 separate sentences for assault, each involving authority figures: a police officer, a security guard, a prison officer. For Thorn, authority isn't something to be respected, but conquered, broken down, revealed as fraudulent. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is Thorn's pathological need for public victories. James, in his ceremonial uniform, represents everything Thorn has spent a lifetime resenting: discipline, institutional respect, established order. Each symbol of tradition and restraint fuels Thorn's determination to prove them hollow. "What would happen if I just—" Thorn's hand hovers in the space between them, not quite touching but threatening the possibility. "Do they program you not to blink, too?" The crowd grows quieter as the confrontation intensifies. For Thorn, breaking James's composure would validate his entire worldview that all authority is ultimately hollow, all discipline eventually breakable. The space between words and weapons is measured not in inches, but in intent. As Thorn's mockery shifts from the uniform to the man who wears it, an ancient warning system, recognized only by those who've faced combat, begins to activate behind James's impassive expression. The ceremonial stillness that tourists admire as quaint tradition conceals a threshold that separates playful curiosity from genuine threat. It's this invisible boundary that Thorn now approaches with reckless abandon. His initial barbs target the superficial. The bearskin cap with its distinctive silhouette, the ceremonial stance that hasn't changed in centuries. Nice hat, mate. Kill that bear yourself, or just robbing its grave? Thorn projects his voice to ensure the gathering crowd hears every word. These are the expected provocations, the kind palace guards endure daily, the verbal equivalent of gnats buzzing around a lion. James has weathered such comments countless times. His training for ceremonial duty included hours of simulated harassment, instructors screaming profanities centimeters from his face, unexpected flashes and startling sounds designed to trigger combat reflexes. The Royal Guards have perfected protocols for these standard provocations. Though James's eyes remain locked forward, a veteran observer would notice the minute change in his breathing pattern, the rhythm shifting from the metronomic 4-count to something slightly more compressed. It's the respiratory equivalent of combat readiness, a physiological preparation invisible to untrained eyes. Behind that mask of ceremonial duty, neural pathways forged in combat zones are quietly assessing threat levels, calculating response options, and maintaining the razor's edge between discipline and defense. Two elderly men in their 70s exchange knowing glances from the perimeter. One wears a regimental tie, the other a subtle lapel pin marking membership in the veteran community. "Been here before, haven't we?" the man with the tie whispers. "Different uniform, same situation." Their weathered hands unconsciously rise to their chests, fingers briefly touching where medals would sit on formal occasions. Their expressions harden as Thorn's words cut deeper. Growing frustrated with James's stoicism, Thorn adjusts his strategy. His mockery becomes surgical, probing for vulnerabilities. "Those medals real, or did they come with the costume?" His voice drops an octave, playground taunts transforming into something darker. "Bet you bought them online. Or maybe Mummy pinned them on for playing soldier." "Heard they just hand those medals out now," Thorn continues, gesturing toward James's chest. "Participation trophies for the military, right?" The statement creates a vacuum of sound. Tourists who moments before were chuckling nervously fall silent, sensing the conversation has veered into sacred territory. "What's that cross one for? Best dressed at the military ball?" Thorn's finger hovers inches from the military cross. "Or did you get it for standing still the longest?" His laughter echoes against stone walls, finding no companions among the onlookers. The subtle shift in James's jaw muscles signals internal calculations far more complex than tourists imagine. The courtyard's ambient noise dims, creating an acoustic spotlight on Thorn's increasingly hostile monologue. Children clutch parents' hands tighter, cameras lower respectfully. Thorn's verbal assault, having failed to produce the desired reaction, begins to manifest physically. His weight shifts forward, a boxer's stance. His shoulders square toward James. His hands hang at his sides, fingers flexing unconsciously. These micro-adjustments broadcast his escalating frustration and imminent physical engagement. "The rifle's not even loaded, is it?" Thorn scoffs loudly. "Probably plastic. All of this is just playing pretend for the tourists." The invisible line between provocation and threat now lies directly in Thorn's path. What he cannot see, what his fundamental misunderstanding prevents him from recognizing, is that he's not approaching a costume but a capability, not a performance but a soldier. What Thorn failed to understand about ceremonial guards is that their stillness isn't weakness. It's the compressed energy of a coiled spring. The moment his hand reached toward the scarlet tunic, the mathematical equation of action and consequence began solving itself with cold precision. The crowd sensed the shift before they could articulate it. Tourists instinctively stepped back as Thorn crossed the invisible boundary separating observer from aggressor. Two elderly veterans watching from the sidelines recognized the prelude to confrontation, exchanging knowing glances before moving toward the nearest palace security officer. Thorn's breathing transformed from steady mockery to the staccato pattern of imminent action. Like a chess player convinced of his opponent's weakness while blind to the trap being set, he advanced with misplaced confidence. The guard, though seemingly focused straight ahead, registered every detail through peripheral awareness, honed in combat zones. "Let's see what these pretty decorations are worth," Thorn snarled, his fingers hovering before making deliberate contact with the row of medals. Symbols of battlefield valor, not mere ornaments. A woman nearby gasped audibly as a father pulled his young son behind him. The atmosphere crystallized into something sharp and dangerous as Thorn grasped the crimson fabric of the tunic's collar. In that single gesture, he breached centuries-old protocol separating respectful observation from criminal interference. The scarlet wool bunched between his fingers as a murmur of alarm swept through the crowd. "Not so tough now, are you?" Thorn whispered, his face inches from the guards. "Just a mannequin in a fancy costume." The guard's discipline held firm, but subtle indicators revealed the transition from ceremonial presence to security response, a fractional widening of stance, an almost imperceptible shift in weight distribution that combat veterans would recognize as preparation for movement. Finding no satisfaction in the guard's composure, Thorn's attention fixed on the ceremonial rifle. What tourists saw as merely ceremonial, soldiers recognized as functional, a service weapon maintained and ready despite its polished appearance and formal use. Thorn saw only a theatrical prop, making a critical error in judgment by failing to distinguish between ceremony and capability. What's this then? Just for show? Thorn's hand released the tunic and moved toward the rifle, fingers extending to grasp the barrel. Time compressed as his hand closed around the polished metal. This crossing from harassment into threat transformed the legal situation instantly. The Royal Guard protocol regarding physical contact with the weapon is unambiguous. Any attempt to touch it constitutes a direct breach requiring immediate intervention. What had been a ceremonial space transformed into a security zone, the guard's role shifting from symbol to soldier between heartbeats. Like a chess player realizing too late that his aggressive move exposed his king, Thorn had triggered an inevitable response. Thorn's grip tightened on the rifle barrel, his mouth opening for another taunt. The words never formed. The moment his fingers wrapped around the weapon, he triggered a response protocol refined through centuries of ceremonial guard duty and honed to lethal effectiveness in combat zones. For the watching crowd, the transformation was almost magical in its precision. The guard's motionless vigil dissolved into fluid motion, years of battlefield instinct channeling into a response calibrated to neutralize the threat without excessive force. The veterans nodded grimly. They had seen it coming from the first sign of Thorn's shifting stance, had recognized in his shortened breath the prelude to aggression. They understood what Thorn could not, that ceremonial duty and combat readiness were not separate states but aspects of the same disciplined mind. While tourists snap photos of the stoic figures in scarlet tunics, few realize they're admiring the controlled stillness of apex predators. The difference between a guard's ceremonial stance and combat response exists in a twilight space, invisible until the moment necessity calls it forth, like a dormant volcano that awakens in an instant. The transformation began with the fingers, not the guards, but Thorn's, as they wrapped around the barrel of the ceremonial rifle. In that instant, the mathematical equation of threat assessment resolved itself with cold precision. The guard's response emerged as a single flowing action, muscle memory activated by thousands of hours of training. Many in the crowd would later swear they'd blinked and missed it. One moment the guard stood motionless, the next, Thorn lay sprawled on the cobblestones. The transition happened with such liquid economy that several tourists continued filming, not yet registering that the tableau had fundamentally changed. The guard's movement began with a quarter-turn pivot, executed with balletic control. His right hand maintained its position on the rifle, while his left executed a sweeping motion that simultaneously created distance and established dominance. The maneuver allowed him to maintain his center of gravity while disrupting his opponents. His actions displayed the cold efficiency of surgical intervention. Each movement served a specific tactical purpose, like a sentence with all unnecessary words removed. The precision left onlookers breathless, their minds struggling to process the sudden shift from ceremonial stillness to tactical mastery. His expression never changed. That's what struck many witnesses most forcefully: the absolute absence of rage, fear, or satisfaction on his face. Even as his body executed a complex defensive sequence, his features remained a mask of professional detachment. The rifle revealed its dual nature. What had seemed decorative became functional in an instant. In a fluid motion, the guard chambered a round, the sound echoing across the courtyard like a crack of lightning. The warning shot struck the ground 3 feet to Thorn's right, sending stone fragments dancing across the courtyard. The noise silenced everything. Birds stopped singing. Tourists froze mid-stride. Even the ubiquitous London traffic seemed momentarily muted. In this acoustic vacuum came the guard's voice. "On your knees, hands visible." A woman clutched her husband's arm, her knuckles white. The command hung in the air, not a shout, but a statement of absolute authority. Each syllable carried the unmistakable timbre of someone accustomed to being obeyed under life-threatening conditions. Thorn's transformation proved equally remarkable. The swagger evaporated instantly, replaced by a visceral understanding of his miscalculation. His body responded to the commands before his mind could form objections. Knees hit stone, hands rose, palms forward, trembling visibly. Having neutralized the threat, the guard returned to his ceremonial position with such fluid precision that the transition between combat stance and ceremonial posture appeared seamless. His rifle resumed its vertical position, his eyes their forward gaze, his body its disciplined stillness. Some tourists, arriving just moments after the incident, expressed confusion at the scene. A man kneeling on the ground, surrounded by palace security who had materialized from side entrances, while the guard himself stood apparently unmoved. The only evidence lay in the small impact mark on the cobblestones and Thorn's unmistakable posture of surrender. A woman from Nebraska whispered to her husband, "Did he actually move? I didn't see him move." A child pointed at the guard and asked, "Why is that man on the ground?" The questions rippled through the crowd as palace security efficiently removed Thorn from the scene. But Thorn knew. The man who had arrived certain of his dominance departed in handcuffs, his face ashen. For the first time in his life, perhaps, he understood the true meaning of power, not in displays of aggression, but in disciplined restraint until the precise moment action becomes necessary. The ripples of a single moment can transform how we see everything that came before it. While Thorn learned about power through humiliation, the watching crowd experienced a different kind of awakening, one that would forever change how they viewed those seemingly decorative rifles and the men who carry them. Police officers approached with professional efficiency, their everyday uniforms suddenly looking plain next to the guard's ceremonial attire. As they secured Thorn and began removing him from the scene, a transformation swept through the onlookers. The crowd, which had gathered for photographs of what many considered living statues, now stood in reverent silence. Their eyes tracked between the subdued Thorn and the guard who had already returned to his post. The connection between them understood in a way tourism brochures never explain. A mother knelt beside her young son, who had been mimicking the guard's stance earlier. "Those are real soldiers who have fought in real wars," she whispered, her tone serious. The boy's eyes widened as he looked at the guard with fresh understanding. Throughout the crowd, similar conversations unfolded as parents seized the educational moment, explaining concepts of duty and service that had been invisible beneath the pageantry minutes before. The ceremonial uniforms that had been photographed as colorful curiosities now commanded genuine respect. Tourists maintained a respectful perimeter, their cameras lowered or forgotten entirely. The scarlet tunic registered as a uniform, the visible symbol of authority backed by training, experience, and legal power. One elderly veteran approached the guard post with deliberate steps, his back straightened with each step, years seeming to fall away as military bearing returned to his posture. When he reached the appropriate distance, a boundary he instinctively respected, he paused. With precision that spoke of decades-old training still living in his muscle memory, he raised his right hand in a crisp salute. Though the guard's eyes remained forward, a moment of recognition passed between them. An acknowledgement between those who understand service in ways civilians rarely grasp. That uniform represents something much deeper, the veteran explained to a nearby family. The ceremonial duties connect to practical defense roles that have existed for centuries. His words carried the weight of experience, and the gathering tourists listened with newfound attention. The crowd's conversation had shifted dramatically. Thoughtful discussions emerged about the nature of service, the weight of tradition, and the reality beneath ceremonial duties. A teacher found himself fielding questions about military history rather than royal gossip. "Did you see how fast he moved?" one teenager asked another, voice hushed with respect. "One second he was standing there, and the next—" "That's what training does," the other replied. "My cousin's in the army. Says the uniform doesn't make the soldier. It's everything you can't see that matters." Near the back of the crowd, a security expert explained that attempting to disarm a royal guard was considered a serious offense. "The response we witnessed was required. These guards operate under clear protocols about when to break their ceremonial stance." His companions nodded thoughtfully, seeing the scene through new eyes. Throughout the palace grounds, the story spread through hushed conversations, creating ripples of respect that extended beyond those who had witnessed Thorn's humiliation. The functional weapon in the guard's hands now symbolized the unbroken line between ceremony and combat readiness, between tradition and discipline. As the afternoon light softened toward evening, the guard remained at his post, his stance identical to before the confrontation. Yet everything surrounding him had changed. Visitors approached with measured steps and appropriate distance. Children's voices dropped to whispers. Photographs were taken with permission rather than entitlement. What had appeared merely decorative now registered as what it truly was: the embodiment of authority, training, and the ever-present capability to maintain order beneath the veneer of tradition. The silence of the Royal Guard isn't an empty gesture, but a deliberate choice, a manifestation of controlled power rather than weakness. What appears to be passive ceremonial duty conceals an active psychological resilience that few civilians comprehend. These men stand as living embodiments of discipline, choosing dignified service over displays of aggression despite constant provocation. When we observe their stillness, we're witnessing exceptional self-control in our reactive world. Their training has forged strength that requires no immediate validation. Guards breaking character remains extraordinarily rare, perhaps once in thousands of hours of service. Consider the guardsman at Buckingham Palace who stands motionless amidst chaos. What personal restraint must this require? How might applying such discipline transform your own responses to life's provocations? These silent sentinels remind us that true strength often lies not in reaction, but in restraint.